Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here on behalf of the Great Lakes Business Network. Welcome. For any new faces, the Great Lakes Business Network is a coalition of more than 200 businesses across the 8 Great Lakes states and with members in Ontario who are committed to advocating for clean water and climate protections, as well as the Great Lakes economy. We're fact-based, nonpartisan, and committed to solutions-oriented advocacy, and we work across a variety of Great Lakes campaign issues. Today, we're really excited and fortunate to have partners joining us to talk about an urgent threat to clean water and water quality in the Great Lakes region, and that is PFAS. So I'd love to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Joining us is Erica Bloom, the Toxics Campaign Director with the Ecology Center, Kathy Martin, a Drinking Water Policy Coordinator with National Wildlife Federation, and Lyndon Mallory, the Alpine Global Product Line Director with Patagonia. So I will turn it over to Erica and Kathy to kick it off with an introduction to PFAS and the work that they're leading with the PFAS Action Network.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you, Lisa, for doing all this work to get us here today. We're looking forward to the opportunity to talk to everyone. As Lisa said, I'm Kathy Martin. I'm the Drinking Water Policy Coordinator for National Wildlife Federation, and I'm here with Erica Bloom of the Ecology Center, and we're here representing the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. And the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network is a coalition of impacted communities that have been impacted by PFAS contamination, supported by and in partnership with nonprofit groups like National Wildlife Federation, the Ecology Center, and the Michigan League of Conservation Voters. And this group works together to advance policy, create organizing space to work on education and awareness building campaigns, do testing in communities, provide funding to communities looking to do PFAS work, and just creating a space for people to share their stories and experiences and lift one another up. And so a little bit before we jump in on what are PFAS and what kind of work are we trying to accomplish here, we wanted to talk a little bit about why we're here today. And as impacted communities and policy advocates, we really see business leaders and retailers having this really critical role on creating and pushing markets that really support a common sense policy. And we're seeing this across the country, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about this today, about the spaces where these policies are being implemented by retailers and by companies that are, one, good for consumers, they're good for innovation, and they often jumpstart work that will be eventually done through regulatory action down the line. Just to take a step back, though, a little bit about PFAS. PFAS are a class of thousands of chemicals. A lot of people know them as forever chemicals. They take an extremely long time to break down and they persist in their environment. They're used to make things grease, water, and stain resistant. I think probably the most common use for them that people think of is non-stick cookware, but they're in so much. They're in clothing, they're in furniture, baby products, cosmetics, dental floss, and another common use is firefighting foam. And that's really a common way that our land and water resources can be contaminated by PFAS. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. And because they're so pervasive, and because there are forever chemicals that persist in environment, there are a lot of pathways that PFAS find their ways into drinking water and homes and the environment. They can leach into the groundwater through landfills. They make it into agricultural land through the application of sewage sludge from PFAS contaminated wastewater treatment plants. They make it into drinking water through a variety of different ways and are also, of course, found in our food and agricultural land. And this is an issue because PFAS are known to cause a number of health impacts, from thyroid issues, cancer, high cholesterol, immune system impacts, reproductive and developmental impacts. And these aren't just experienced by people. Wildlife also experience impacts from PFAS contamination. And this little graphic here is from an environmental working group report that links the impacts of PFAS on human health to those on wildlife health, and helps use what we know from research on how humans have been impacted on PFAS to see how wildlife may be impacted. And Eric and I will share out some links throughout the presentation, but the PFAS Exchange is a great website to sort of learn a little bit more about what these exposure pathways are, how to find out if you might want to look into some exposure, health resources on how to talk to your physicians about PFAS exposure, and things like that. So PFAS are found across the country. We're focusing on the Great Lakes today. They're found across the world. And the Great Lakes have a lot of PFAS sites because of a lot of the land uses that have historically occurred. And Great Lakes states across the Rust Belt region, a lot of manufacturing has resulted in a lot of PFAS. And then we also have states like Michigan that have done a lot of testing. And so you see a lot more PFAS sites in those sort of states. But even if it looks like other states don't have a lot of sites, it might also just mean that there's less testing being done. And Erica will be talking a little bit more about testing in states like Michigan. But this is another resource the Environmental Working Group has put out where you can see a map of sites throughout the country of PFAS contamination. PFAS is extremely costly. Remediating and addressing PFAS is extremely costly. Over $3 trillion has been spent on remediation efforts, and a lot of that, a big chunk, 36%, have been spent on the Great Lakes states. New York and Michigan have the highest costs in the country. This website down here, the Nonstick Nightmare, is a good resource to click through and see which states have spent how much funding on this. And this will bring up certain policy priorities that we have in terms of how we pay for these costs that have been incurred by our communities, taxpayers, and what we think should be policy adjustments and how that is handled. But it's not just about the dollars aspect of it. We have a number of studies about the way that PFAS have impacted the Great Lakes ecosystems. We have fish studies here where PFAS were found in 95% of the fish in a Notre Dame study, and all of the fish in an Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant study, and an Indiana University study found PFAS in air, rain, atmosphere, and water across the Great Lakes Basin as well. And these impacts extend into our communities in ways like impacting tourism, specifically ecotourism. Oscoda, Michigan has had contamination through the Wurtsmith Air Force Base, which is PFAS contamination caused by the firefighting foam. And that has resulted in things like do not fish and do not hunt advisories that impact people's abilities to go out and participate in being able to fish and hunt, and has also resulted in a lot of foam on Lake Huron, and that has impacted recreational opportunities. The Ecology Center, along with a number of other partners, released a report really looking at the extent of foam on Lake Huron. Here you can see some pictures at the Tawas Point State Park, which shows some of the extent of the foam found there. And there is work that's happening across the nation at a federal level and on a state level to begin to address PFAS. And what we're focusing today is really on state level policy, looking at a few of the Great Lakes states as an example, specifically Michigan we'll talk a little bit more about in depth. But the states are taking a lot of action to addressing the extent of the PFAS crisis in a number of different ways. The main big way is what we call turning off the tap on PFAS, and that is banning it altogether in the use of products, or banning product categories, banning PFAS in certain product categories. So we see states like Minnesota had a comprehensive ban, Amara's law that's been enacted, that is really serving as a model for other states to showcase the ways that you can do a really holistic, comprehensive ban on PFAS in consumer products. And other states are targeting specific uses. like Illinois banning the use of PFAS in firefighting foam, and Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin have banned it in the use in firefighting foam for training purposes. There's also policies around transparency, disclosure, and labeling. So really allowing people to know when PFAS is in the products that they're using. There are firefighting foam take-back programs and also disposal policies. And so these sort of speak to what happens with our PFAS after they have been used. How are they being disposed of in a way that doesn't result in them getting back into water and air and land resources. Indiana has had implemented some policies on protecting firefighters through biomonitoring programs that firefighters, because of their proximity to firefighting foam, have workplace exposures and higher risks of experiencing health impacts due to PFAS. And so that is an approach that Indiana has taken. And then a number of the states have really taken the charge forward in terms of funding. So really writing different remediation, cleanup, impacted community support into their appropriations bills to begin to tackle this issue. And I think now I'll turn it over to Erica to sort of talk more specifically about what some of those policies look like in practice.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. That was a great overview. And I wanted to talk a bit more about what's happening in Michigan. So the Ecology Center and the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, we're based in Michigan, started a lot of our work. The idea is to expand into more Great Lakes states, but using Michigan right now kind of as, okay, here's what's happening and here's some of the progress that's made and challenges has been a way that we've connected with other community members and nonprofits. So some of the things that have been happening in Michigan are progress at the administrative level. In 2021, there was a PFAS-free procurement executive directive from Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And that's really a model for other states. It was kind of class-based around all PFAS and all product categories. Around regulatory, our Department of Great Lakes Energy and Environment started the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. And it's actually an interagency team. So it's EGLE plus like our Department of Health and Human Services. And this convening is pretty unique for a state model because it's coordinating lots of different actions and agencies as a response. So again, this is more on the downstream, once PFAS is in the environment, how are we taking care of it? How are we identifying and doing remediation? But it's really important to communities who have been harmed by PFAS that they're involved in this MPART, as we call it. We've also have some of the higher standards for PFAS in drinking water and groundwater. As some of you know, the EPA recently passed national drinking water standards, which was a very big win for the country. But still, the states that have had drinking water standards are kind of leveraging sort of a way forward because we've already been working within those guidelines. And then other things that we've been doing around industrial pretreatments for PFAS, like in the wastewater and utilities, and then fish and other wildlife advisories in surface water and, when you're hunting. So we've done a lot on the regulatory side, and that's good. We've also appropriated monies from our state budget over the last few years to contaminated sites broadly, and then in specific contaminated sites in our state. And then we've had lawsuits, working within the Department of the Attorney General, lawsuits against PFAS manufacturers, even, airports. So really trying to tackle this issue from all sides in the administration. And there's lots more that we can do, but I wanted to highlight some of that progress in the last couple of years. Kathy already kind of talked a little bit about Michigan and the legislative side. It's unfortunately this issue it's not going away because we're still producing PFAS and still disposing and discharging PFAS into the environment. And so communities continue to face harm in their groundwater, their residential wells, rivers, soils, fish, you name it. And so it's still a really top of mind issue for many community members. And some of them have been dealing with not only, private industries who are discharging, or the state that's kind of doing the regulatory piece of this, but also the federal government itself is one of the primary polluters of PFAS through the Department of Defense. And in Escoda, Michigan, we work closely with community members there who are true advocates, years of advocacy against the DoD, who's being very slow in the cleanup process there. And, we talk about Michigan a lot of times as being a leader, and in many ways we are. However, I think when you look at what we've done legislatively, kind of on the turn off the tap or prevention side, we've made minimal progress. We've done some actions around PFAS and firefighting foam, which is important. But if you look at us compared to other states who have really moved forward on banning PFAS in food packaging and textiles, apparel, furniture, you name it, we haven't done any of that in Michigan. And so that's something that we really are hoping to see happen. Certainly we'll see what happens in the end of our legislative session, but building up campaign planning for that. And Kathy mentioned that another exposure route is through agricultural land, through applying biosolids or sewage sludge as fertilizers. That has been a big problem in Michigan and other states around exposing wildlife, crops, cattle to PFAS. And so we are advocating that there's a financial safety net for farmers who find PFAS in their ag land. Maine has had good success in developing a program to support farmers. And so we hope that Michigan can follow that lead and maybe even get something at the national level. Because as we've mentioned, it's extremely expensive to clean up this stuff. And a lot of times it's almost impossible to clean it up because PFAS, they stick around, as they are known as the forever chemical. Even, incineration, disposal, all of those things have kind of alternative sort of issues with them. So we're really advocating to support communities that have already been harmed, turn off the tap on this stuff, get it out of our products, and really look at alternatives that are safer. So I think as retailers and businesses, that's something where you all can come in and help with that. Next slide. I kind of already went over this, but I just wanted to highlight the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. It's really been centered around community members who have had PFAS contamination in their drinking water or in their bodies of water, agricultural. And this is a picture of us at the National PFAS Conference this June in Ann Arbor. It was a chance for all of us to meet in person and a great opportunity to kind of increase our power building and momentum around creating change and doing things at the policy level and encouraging companies as well to look into their practices. Next slide. So I wanted to leave you with, to make sure that you know that there are opportunities to get involved. There's bills right now in the Michigan legislature and in other Great Lakes states that we are trying to get hearings on, that we would need people to write testimony from your perspective as a business leader, write opinion articles to local media outlets, and just get to know what we're doing better. I mean, we're always educating. We have a Facebook page, we have a newsletter. So if this is something that's new to you and you want to find out more, there's lots of opportunities to do that. Even just knowing more about PFAS and how do you get in out of your products, we can be a resource for that. So there's lots of ways to get involved. And I wanted to leave you too with some resources, and we will share these. There's some links that we'll share out in an email. These are some things with the Green Science Policy Institute, Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, ways of doing things, ways of alternative purchasing that you may be interested in, products that don't contain PFAS that might be good, as you're looking to kind of think about phasing out or what you might need to look out for, which products. The American Sustainable Business Council has a great fact sheet on making the case for why businesses need to be involved in this and kind of the role. And then we threw in a couple other resources. There's a campaign of advocates that looks at retailers and does a retailer report card and kind of creates kind of momentum and public attention around companies that are doing the right thing and you know, phasing out and making plans, and then those that are not responding to what consumers want. And then finally, the Ecology Center has done a lot of work on toxic-free procurement, and we have a PFAS-free purchasing fact sheet, which could be helpful, you know, as you're learning more. So that's a lot of information, but just kind of as a broad overview, we wanted to give you lots of resources and things to think about. Could go to the next slide. And then this is our information. Again, we'll make sure that everyone has it, our websites, our Facebook pages, and then our emails as well. So thank you so much for your time. And if we have, you know, questions at the end, we can take those. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Kathy and Erica. And we'll make sure to send out all of those resources as a follow-up after this webinar. And I also just wanted to mention we are going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So I see a couple of questions rolling in, but do feel free to enter those in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So now I'd love to pass it over to Lyndon with Patagonia to talk a little bit about the work that they have done to transition PFAS out of their technical gear and products.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Erica. Maybe I'll start with acknowledging a little bit of where we are in this space and my perspective. One, I'm a product person, so I help lead the product teams, but I'm not a chemical specialist. So if you have hard questions about PFAS, I will kindly deflect them. Two, we're a big organization, and I acknowledge that, right? You know, Patagonia has scale and it has size. That being said, I can't seem to get my internet to work today, so Lisa is actually driving the PowerPoint for us. So we share some things with small businesses, but I do acknowledge that, you know, some of my perspectives, we have the weight of size. PFAS has been a hot topic of conversation for us for better part of a decade and a half now, and I want to walk you through a little bit about our journey and share with you how we've navigated, and in full transparency, how we are navigating it. I think I chose this photo to frame up the beginning, which is like, that's where we are. We recognize like we left one side of a past paradigm and working towards the future state, and we're in a phase of that future state, but there's a long ways for us to go as an organization, as an industry, and certainly as a broader society around that. PFAS, we've heard a lot about why they're bad. I'll be a little controversial for a hot sec. PFAS are kind of cool through a narrow lens. Why are they everywhere? Because they work so damn well. So why is this something that we're talking about, right? So as you've heard of, these are really prevalent. And the reason that they are so prevalent, again, I'm not a science expert, but I'll boil it down into two basic things. They're really slippery, and they're really long lasting. Hence the conversation around forever chemicals, right? So there's a benefit in that for consumer goods. And again, acknowledge I'm speaking mainly through consumer goods here, but whether it's in textiles, like I'll discuss, medical devices, right? Stints, things like that, firefighting, aviation foam, your In-N-Out burger wrapper, cosmetics, ski wax, right? If you like to ski and play outside, the reason that you get to slide these days is because of fluorine to a certain extent, obviously paints. And if you have a touchscreen and you've appreciated what a smartphone does, PFAS have played a role in that. Now, what we've learned, right? So they're really slippery, they're really long lasting, but they have some pretty significant consequences as well. And there's a realization and an appreciation of what that's starting to happen. So I'll take this kind of conversation down to like how Patagonia has been using PFAS and what we've learned throughout this process. So for a starter, this is a little bit technical in the apparel space, but we have PFAS quite widely, we have PFAS have been used in an element of our materials quite widely up to a certain point, and we use them in durable water repellents. I'll talk about that in a second. Actually, the bulk of where we use these things are in what we consider non-critical materials, so non-waterproof materials, and then a smaller amount of the materials that we use are quite critical. And what we've been learning through this whole process of trying to convert is that PFAS are showing up everywhere. So we tend to think of them as like a waterproof, breathable, or a DWR situation, but we're realizing that they're actually coming in manufacturing processes of zippers. They can come in different types of acrylics. So that kind of discovery, both in terms of the elements that are being used or in the manufacturing process, right? One of the reasons that you can get really interesting plastic molded trim sets for, your latest Gore-Tex jacket is because of how PFAS helped the creation of that zipper head, right? So you might not have a zipper head that has PFAS in it, but the manufacturing process is leading on it. Again, that's just kind of context to say it's really widely used across the apparel space. The way that it's being talked about the most is in like what we consider critical or waterproof breathable spaces. And that's really where the bulk of like legislation that's happening in the United States is around. It's happening closer in Europe. And it's where I'm going to focus the conversation today because I think it's the most impactful. And certainly as someone who leads the outdoor category here, it's had a lot of impact in how we think about apparel. So quick little material moment. I get to be a material dork for a second. This is how waterproof jackets work. You basically have a face fabric. You have the membrane. So you can see that thing that says Gore-Tex. That's the membrane that actually keeps you dry. And then most jackets have some sort of liner, whether it's a material or a coating or a hung liner. The membrane itself is what keeps you dry. It's these highly engineered things that allow water vapor to move through the barrier, but keep water droplets out, like this graphic is showing. And then that face fabric, that red fabric, that's what you actually see when you have a jacket on, right? And you choose the color, you're choosing the color of the face fabric, not the membrane. That face fabric, what it does is it protects the membrane and it allows it to work. And one of the ways that it protects the membrane is it's coated in this stuff called durable water repellent, DWRs. And DWRs have up to this point in the outdoor space relied on fluorinated chemistries, PFAS. That's because PFAS essentially coat that fabric. They're really, really slippery. So from a scientific standpoint, what they do is reduce the surface tension of the face fabric so that the surface tension of the water droplet is higher, so it stays as a bead and rolls off. So there's also use of PFAS to a certain point in membranes themselves. Not all membranes are the same, but it's fairly universal to think about PFAS being on that surface coating. So why do we care? Why do we want that? One, it's making that jacket work, right? It's helping protect that membrane, helping keep the water off. In situations like this, it allows that water not to soak through that face fabric and freeze. And it also heavily drives perception of quality. So I bring that up because, us as businesses, as manufacturers, as customers, we have a responsibility to our customers around quality performance, whether you're building an iPhone or a waterproof jacket. And PFAS have been a large part of what it means to buy a performing jacket, right? If you put on a jacket and it beads up and it rolls off, that speaks to not only the brand Gore-Tex, not only the brand Patagonia, but this idea of like what it means to have quality. And we found ourselves in a situation where we're using this thing, which works so damn well to help with that beading process. And then the more we learned about it, the less comfortable we felt with what this thing did, right? And I think what's been important to call out here is what we've learned so far is really PFAS are quite impactful in the manufacturing process and the downstream effects of what it means to make them, but relatively inert once they're applied to product, right? So where I'm going with that is, will your Patagonia jacket make you sick? No. Does the manufacturing process of fluorinated DWRs have an impact on the world that we live in? Absolutely. Some of the studies that I've read, we all have PFAS in our blood. It's found in the Antarctic ice sheet. It's been found at the top of Mount Everest, right? These are all chemicals that didn't exist 70 years ago, and suddenly they're ubiquitous. So where am I going with that? We had this moment to figure out like, oh my gosh, we have this thing that works so well. What do we do? And there's a lot of information on the screen. I think the thing to call out is one of the things that I love about working with Patagonia is we sit in moments like this and we listen to people who know what they're talking about, right? And that's not always coming from the apparel world. And we started to learn more about like what these PFAS were back in the early 2000s. And that really kicked off this conversation, which there was zero business case to start exploring alternative chemistries, right? But we realized that there were these long chains, fluorinated chemistries called C8. They're pretty damaging. So we started to look at C6. The whole industry started to move that direction. We realized that C6 is maybe not that good after all, like sugar-free, fat-free. Turns out it's not that healthy. Same thing here, like you can't really cut corners. And we kicked off this work really in earnest around 2015, 2016, where we started, you can see that kind of on the left side of the screen, where we started to say, okay, current situations and current solutions aren't viable for us. We are an outdoor clothing company. outdoor clothing needs to keep you warm and dry. One of the ways that we keep you dry is using DWRs with our current technologies. We need to find an alternative solution, like Erica was saying, for how do we continue to provide this consumer benefit without using this thing. And that kicked off about 5 years worth of work where we had no solutions. We had a lot of failures. And one of the things that I take from it was a long process. And basically, you know, without going too deep into the product creation process, we spend a lot of time working on basically four types of testing. One is like running something through a lab. The second one is starting to apply it to other textiles. We put it out in the field, and then we have to scale it up. And I'm happy to go deeper into that, but I won't bore you too much with our go-to-market process. But this is really this moment where we started to unpack non-fluorinated chemistries. We recognized that like we had a long ways to go. One of the first fabrics that we got back that was non-fluorinated was so stiff that we could actually tear it in half, right? So we were able to replicate the performance of non-fluorinated chemistries, but we were not able to provide a product to our customers that felt like it was relevant and worthwhile. You can jump to the next slide, Lisa. Go. So the way that we scaled this work was we started with non-critical fabrics. We kind of started in areas where it was maybe less impactful from a customer perspective. And we focused on performance solutions. So we focused on like formulations, essentially like how do we replicate DWRs without using fluorine? And we very quickly learned that these things aren't like non-fluorinated chemistries aren't like fluorinated chemistries, meaning we have to apply them differently. We have to interact with textiles differently. And that really changed the way that we think about scaling. And we had a lot of failures, you know, as the person that kind of sits between our athletes and our materials team. We had a lot of calls from really angry climbers and skiers about products that weren't working. If you want to jump to the next slide. You know, this is what happens when a fabric fails, right? You can see how wet and shiny that person is. They get cold, they get clammy. And I share that because it was more than just a performance problem. Like, you know, it was a confidence problem. We started to have really, you know, some of our athletes question if Patagonia's commitment to quality was where it had been, because we were having them try these fabrics that just weren't performing. But slowly, you know, over the course of time and iteration, you can see where I'm going with this, we started to find solutions and textiles that were getting us there. And a major moment for us was figuring out kind of those two things that I discussed. Like one is formulations, two is applications. Like how do we find the right things? You can jump to the next slide. And we started to learn a few things, and we also recognize that there's a lot that we can do and there's a lot that other folks can do. You can jump to the next slide. So as we started to make progress in getting formulations that were working, we also looked out for partners. And this is a space, again, when I go back to my comment at the beginning, this is a conversation for Patagonia to solve for our products. It's a conversation for the industry to solve, and it's something for us society to solve. We looked for partners to do that, and we actually worked really closely with Gore-Tex. We had been bothering them for years about wanting alternative solutions to fluorinated things. And as they started to see the writing on the wall around legislation and the shift of the market, they came back to us, and we started to collaborate on creating new textiles, because actually current Gore-Tex membranes or previous Gore-Tex membranes have fluorine in them, working on a membrane that doesn't have fluorine as well as a DWR. And that was really important for two reasons. One is an R&D, but also the second one is a scaling conversation, right? How do we have impact? And our point of view is if we can figure out a solution with Gore-Tex, Gore-Tex can bring that to the rest of the industry, right? Patagonia is not going to go to North Face and sell a Patagonia fabric to North Face, but Patagonia can work with Gore-Tex to create a fabric that Gore-Tex can sell to North Face and Arc'teryx and every other brand to make sure that we have impact. And again, I think that's where it goes back to the benefits of this conversation. Jump to the next slide, Lisa. And that kind of put us in a spot where we are now, which is we have a collection of materials, we have a collection of chemistries, of applications. We've been able to get past fabrics that tear in half when you pick them up. We have beading materials. We have ways that are working. If you jump to the next slide, this is a little bit of a snapshot of where we've been in this process, right? So you can see from 2015 to 2019 was all R&D, trying to figure out what's going on, where we are. 2020, we introduced really small amounts of non-fluorinated materials and liners of jackets, actually, so pretty far away from that end use. And then very quickly turned up that dial where, you know, in 2024, we'll be fully PFC free by the end of the year. And that includes, you know, obviously main body materials, but trims. I would say, if you jump to the next slide, we're still, as that bullet point at the bottom says, like, we're getting there. I'm really proud of the work that the team has done to this point. We've been able to convert a massive amount of products across our complex global supply chain in time with legislation that's really ramped up. And, the side note on a business case standpoint, we're really well positioned for legislation that's coming into the state of California and New York, and starting January 2024. The product that has PFAS in it needs to be either not sold or labeled. And we're in a position where this foresight 15 years ago would allowed us to kind of be ready for that. That wasn't a strategic business decision. It was a decision that was made off of doing the right thing for our customers. But we're still in that process. Jump to the next slide. One of the second things that we're learning, which I do think is relevant, is there is this whole other layer of not only finding solutions, as Erica mentioned, but like, how do we have a conversation about what it means to live in a post-fluorinated world, right? I go back to what I said earlier, these things work. And now we're asking our customers to use a less good thing from a performance standpoint. And it's absolutely the right thing that we need to do, but it's also changing our mindset. And the analogy that I'll use is, EVs versus combustion engine cars. Both will get you from A to B, but how you think about preparing for your trip, how you drive your vehicle, how you refuel, so to speak, in between are iteratively different. Is one better than the other? I won't pass judgment on that. I have a strong point of view on it, but I realize this is the state of Michigan. But that's the same thing with our jackets now, right? And so where I'm going with this is, while we have new fluorinated chemistries that are really hydrophobic, they repel water really well, we haven't found solutions that are very oilophobic. So they don't repel greases and oils quite as well. So we see jackets that get dirty, sunscreen, mayonnaise, you name it. And that kind of the oils will knock down that hydrophobicity. It won't bead as quickly. And now we're having a conversation around our customers. Well, when your jacket's dirty, how do you get it to work well? You wash it. If you jump to the next slide, we're spending a ton of time and energy and resources right now, basically getting customers to believe us in this slide, which is, if you have a jacket on the left-hand side that's brand new, after you use it, you can see it starts to wear out. If you clean it, it works again. If you jump to the next slide, we're hosting washing parties and Instagram things and telling people to please do your laundry. And that is part of what it means to be transitioning to PFAS in Patagonia. And I pulled this one in particular because this is a shot of the wash party that happened in Tokyo, in Shibuya, in our store there. This isn't a topic of conversation in Japan. It's not a topic of conversation in Asia. This is something that is very much concentrated in North America and Europe, because those are the cultures that are aware of what's happening in PFAS. But as a business, if I kind of go back to what I said at the beginning of like our responsibility, I think it's part of that conversation to take this message to other communities and cultures that are very much affected by this issue and start to engage them. So these wash parties and these product solutions, I think, while they can be specific to legislation that's happening in a couple of states, obviously carry a lot of weight globally. And that's kind of where we are. So I ended on this slide to say, like, we've made some progress. We still have a long ways to go. I think we feel confident and happy with the products that we have, but the more that we learn, and I feel confident that if we get together in 5 years, we'll have a different story, because we will learn more about what's happening, the impacts of these things. And that's why these moments together to really brainstorm and figure out solutions are so important, I think, to all of us, and certainly to businesses that need to operate in this space. So thank you. That was amazing driving. I appreciate it. I'm also like hiding from the sun as it moves across here, so I'm gonna switch picnic tables.
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much for that wonderful overview. And it's really interesting to see how you're navigating not only on a company level, but trying to shift the entire industry into a greener space. So I personally really appreciated that perspective. I want to open it up to Q&A. I know that we have one question to start, so I can kick us off. This question is from Sam, one of our GLBN members. What can businesses do to find out if they have PFAS in their products via the supply chain?
I can try and take an answer, but this is where I'm going to go back to the qualifier I made at the beginning. I work for a really big company that invests a lot of money in supply chain transparency. So actually, many of the resources that Erica shared at the end there, like business groups, that's a really important part. I'll say something really dumb. Ask. We've been spending a lot of time just asking and helping our suppliers understand this question. I think I would acknowledge like cultural nuance. What we are talking about right now in this moment, if I talk to an Asian supplier, they look at me and they go, what are you talking about? I've never even heard of this, and this isn't really an issue. So a lot of it is not necessarily having the right URL link, but it's being able to be really clearly communicate and ask the questions. And don't be surprised when you don't get the answer that you're hoping for. Erica or Kathy, anything to add to that? Because this is not my wheelhouse. I'm the puffy jacket guy, not the supply chain transparency guy.
Yeah, I don't work in supply chains either, but I know that comes up a lot when we're working on policy and these bills that are banning PFAS as industries or businesses come out and say, well, I just don't know what's in my products. And so this is something that we're actually trying, like you said, to educate. It's not just the retailer, it's people all across the supply chain that actually need to figure this out, and they need to be asking each other because someone knows. And so it's part of, I think, this culture shift of what we're trying to do is that because PFAS can migrate, right, and they can get into the product from even like the manufacturing process. There's so many different ways. So one of the things, and this is not directly answering your question, but we've started with in our policies, it says intentionally added PFAS, which is something important to note because it is difficult around the supply chain to know. So that's where we're starting. So it's a little bit easier to figure that out than unintentionally added.
Thank you so much. One other thing that we've heard from a lot of our businesses is that they know that PFAS is bad, but that alternatives can also come with their own challenges. And I know, Lyndon, you mentioned that in terms of performance, but perhaps there's other alternatives that create challenges with single use or plastics or things like that. So I guess what advice would you give to businesses who want to phase out PFAS but are worried that there isn't a perfect alternative solution?
Try this one too. This is where I get speaking from the experts. I'll speak personally on this one. I would call bullshit on the idea that you can't find an alternative, right? Like I have never found a moment where we haven't. I'll use cookware as an example. Teflon works so well, it uses PFAS. There is a lot of people that are very committed to cast iron, and there are other ways to cook besides Teflon. And it's the same thing in waterproof breathables. It's the same way that we talk about any consumer goods. It's really different in firefighting and medical devices, and that's not my area of expertise. But I know for product that isn't necessarily saving lives in real time and in that moment, the solution may not be right in front of us, but I think it's on us as members of this society and as business leaders to engage our customers and have the respect with them to engage them in that conversation. So I'll bring it back to the thing that I'm talking about. I've spent a lot of time talking about doing laundry, and that's not to sound pedestrian or in any way, but to really get this shift, this idea that you're breaking paradigms and you're resetting them. And we can get to a point where if it turns out your jacket's covered in grease and dirt and it's wetting out, you don't need to go buy a new jacket nor use one that's going to have significant impacts on the health of our global ecosystems. You can just wash your jacket and then we'll be okay. And that sounds very simplistic, yet often I find that conversation gets overlooked, and we live in a world of convenience and information, and it's really easy to just look for the next quickest thing. But I'm not convinced that we can't have an iPhone that won't work just as well and make us just as happy and all the things that phone does without PFAS. We just have to get there and respect our customers in that process. Again, that's a simplistic statement, but I have found that when we engage that conversation, even our most skeptical diehard climbers who wear wet out. I go back to that photo I showed you, where if you're icing through and you're halfway up north face in the Alps in winter, that's really different than me being uncomfortable on my way from the car to the office, right? Those are two really different situations. Yet them understanding that, washing their jackets ahead of time and going out to the climb has been able to negate this thing that 18 months ago was like, you guys are ruining this company and driving this product into the ground, right? We can have an informed conversation. So that would be my optimistic techno optimist point of view in how we navigate that.
I have a question for you, Lyndon, if there aren't any other questions at the moment. Just because we work, so much in the policy arena, is that something that you're seeing? You did kind of mention it, like it's kind of you know, in California and New York, there's these states that are kind of moving things. Do you feel that, like, from a industry perspective, that there's it's realistic, like these things are it's happening and we have to hurry up and catch up to the policy? Or I know Patagonia is kind of ahead of that, but like what about other companies that are like facing these, you know, state laws, and how is that, just that interface kind of going? Like are companies talking about that? Are they feeling like they can make shifts in a way that can meet these goals for the states?
That's a good question. I think we are so early in this process of understanding what this global supply chain is that we work on, and whether you're talking about PFAS or microplastics or you know, how we create synthetic textiles, like there's just a lot there. And I say that not through a lens of pessimism, but an acknowledgement of like we have lived in a world of abundance up to this point, and suddenly we're realizing the impacts of that and the implications. We don't know, right? And I say that, and I like, that's why I think these conversations are so important. You know, I've had conversations with small wax manufacturers. They're like, I don't even know where to begin. What do we do? And how do we think about it? And I'm seeing kind of a couple of things in earnestness to find better solutions. It's not going to happen overnight. If I use the outdoor industry, the one that I live in, this is really disruptive to how we do business. When you think about where we are as a market, I don't know how closely you follow this space, but like the post-COVID shock. Now, not everyone needs a bike. That's hitting the outdoor market overall. Yet brands are still committed to making these shifts, even when moments where if most of your business is in Asia, you don't need to comply just because of what, you know, us hippies out in California want to do. And we're seeing this like focus and this effort to make the shift across the board, right? Gore-Tex did not need to make this commitment, and it's happening. And I applaud folks. It's easy for me in a privately held company with founders that really want to do the right thing to make these decisions. It's a really different conversation when you don't have the luxury of that type of leadership, but people are certainly pushing forward. So I would say that's the first question. Then honestly, the conversation, the curiosity, and that willingness to fail a little bit and bring, you know, for us, bringing that customer along the way and making sure that we're taking risks in the right places. I'll use my alpinist versus rainwear example, right? One thing to have a liner wet out more quickly than you want to. It's another thing to think about an alpinist failing. We've dropped product, right? We've dropped $20 million product categories because we didn't have a solution in time, and we had to look for that revenue in other places, and it hurt. You know, it's not fun to sit in front of the Patagonia board and say, well, here's why we're down this year, but it's the right call, and I think it set us up in the long run. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Erica, but I think I would just say, yeah, we're still so deep in the trenches. And I'll go back to that first slide that I said. I'm like really happy that we have non-fluorinated DWRs, but you know, I'm sure my conversation next month will be slightly different. So if you're feeling overwhelmed out there, I share your sentiment.
All right, we have another question from the audience. So I will try to summarize. It's a long one. Thank you, Meredith. So Meredith shares that she has experience in supplier transparency on the human rights side of things, and from her perspective, feels that there should be more subject matter experts on supply chain teams. So I think this is probably a question for Lyndon, but how do you communicate these kinds of messages around PFAS and what to do about it across different audiences, both with your customers and leadership within the company? And then perhaps the GLPN folks can speak to the community level communication.
That's a good question. Again, I'll acknowledge my privilege here in the sense that there's a whole building over there that gets to do this, and yet we still feel ourselves understaffed. So this, to your point, Meredith, like this is something that is so complex and so deep. The question, I think, I'll talk about communication for a second. And again, forgive me for sounding too philosophical, but one of the things that I really appreciate about a brand like this, and it's not exclusive to Patagonia, but I recognize that it's somewhat rare, is the intention to do right. And so meaning often we don't spend a lot of time communicating things that people don't need to know. And that's not through a sense of hiding anything, but you know, we'll have these conversations, and often we're launching a whole new product right now that has elements of recyclability that we don't have the supply chain to recycle it. In 5 to 10 years, I hope we do, but that's not going in any communication. It's not going in any marketing team. I have the North American sales team sitting in that building over there in a moment about this very product, and I won't tell them that it can be recycled, because that's not something that we can claim, yet it was the right thing to do. So where I'm going with that is like, not everything goes all the way out to the customer, but we really focus on what we're trying to communicate. So one is that ability to ask the hard questions and make the right choices, and then also, I think within that framework of decision making, right? What's need to know versus nice to know, and sometimes the nice to know stuff doesn't always get through the customer, even though I feel good about making the right choices. And again, I say that not through a lens of hiding anything, but not always trumpeting all of your wins. One of the best examples that I'll end on is we did a survey, I want to say 2017, 2018, where at that point, maybe 20% of our main body materials were recycled. And we asked what people thought about Patagonia product, and they thought they were 100% recycled. So from a marketing standpoint, done, right? We hadn't done any of the work on the product side. We still had 80% to go, but our customer already thought that we were there. And I can't speak to why, but we continued to do that work. And we didn't really talk about it that much. We just got to where we knew we needed to be, even though the customer already thought we were there.
And yeah, I can jump in a little bit on the community aspect of the messaging. At least for GLPAN, really our number one priority is communities that have been impacted by PFAS and people that have been exposed to PFAS. And so that has been so much of our focus is really strengthening the education there in community to ensure that people know, you know, what does exposure mean, how you might have been exposed, like what actions can you take? And then of course, talking through these policies that are really developed by these group of communities and these group of people that say, I wish I had this when this happened to me. And we need to make sure that, you know, we have these safety nets available for people. So that has been so much of the focus. And I think that the conversations like this are so welcomed and so important because that brings us back into other spaces where we're not exercising our brains in this way as much. And it's so important to hear all of this perspective and to learn more about what it looks like to really have a transition away from PFAS from people that would be actually the practitioners in doing that. And so I think a lot of time people see the work we do as, you know, limiting innovation, but what we see it as opportunities for innovation. The work that you are all doing, Lyndon, is innovation, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, resources. But I think that's something that we're trying to do a lot more of, is connect to other communities or other groups or interests that we might not have done so much in the past, to really see how this can be collaborative and how much more powerful it is to do across groups and industries.
And I'll just add, one of the things, especially at the Ecology Center, we try and educate people on is like the full life cycle of a product. So even if you, the customer, are just coming in contact with the thing for a brief point of your, you know, its life, there's so much more to making, you know, creating, making, using chemicals and different materials, and then the disposal. And so when you start thinking about it like that, and I know many of us do, but it can be hard when our culture, right, is just very consumer based, go on to the next product. But a lot of these, you know, the PFAS and other chemicals, a lot of the problems are in the manufacturing and then the disposal part of it. And so that sort of like shift in that education has been an important part of, we're educating lawmakers on that, you know, communities. We had a very high profile, unfortunate case in West Michigan with a shoe company that manufactured, you know, the great shoes, but the weight, the tannery waste was just, it went everywhere around the county. And so decades of that, and now decades later, that community is facing real challenges. So it's sort of this thing where you think about, okay, you just have the product for a short period of time, but the repercussions of that can last for decades in many ways. So that's just something I think about as a communications or just a general education to people who are kind of get it.
Yes, thank you all so much for that perspective. Well, it looks like we are about at time. So I want to thank our panelists so much for sharing all of this knowledge and, all of the upcoming action opportunities and, including businesses in this movement, because as you mentioned, it's such a powerful voice in addressing this threat. So thank you all again for participating, and thank you for our attendees. We will follow up with some resources for understanding more about PFAS at your business and how you can get involved in the movement. Take
Thank
care,
you,
everyone.
Saul.
So